Good morning and welcome to this tutorial on can we make government work, a question that's very much on all of our minds, I'm sure. My name is Todd Breifogel and I direct the seminars program at the Aspen Institute. And it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Gerson, who's moderating this program, and turn the floor over to him.
Thank you very much. Our topic today is can we make government work? I detect a little irony or humor in asking a former Bush administration official to moderate a panel on this subject. But fortunately, we have some real experts here today on the successes and failures of government. So let me make just a couple of brief introductions. Congresswoman Jane Harman is sometimes called a blue dog Democrat. Actually, she is really a principled and thoughtful Democrat. And she's also has a reputation for being an outspoken Democrat, which is not only good for a politician, but good for us. So
I don't get this at home.
Henrietta Fore was director of USAID and holding the title also of Director of U.S. Foreign Assistance. She was also the director of the U.S. Mint, making her a good friend in a time of need. And Paul Verkyle is one of America's leading legal scholars, was president of William & Mary, and is now chairman of the Administrative Conference of the United States. It's a body that's charged with improving the efficiency and fairness of federal agencies, so it relates very directly to our discussion. And David Gergen is a former White House official and a political commentator. And in spite of all these things, he's one of the most respected voices of civility and moderation in America. So it's a good group to discuss this topic. Let me get started just with the moderator's prerogative, just make a couple of points that might be worth reacting to. Recently, I met with Governor Mitch Daniels, who's often talked about as a possible Republican presidential candidate. And he is, in person, very libertarian, very skeptical of government, even anti-government in some ways. But when I asked him what he was most proud of as governor, the response he gave me is that he had reduced the wait times at the Indiana DMV to under 9 minutes. And actually it had kept track of it that morning, that it was at 8 minutes, 16 seconds. It struck me that even in a fairly anti-government time, people want government to work. It has to work in their daily lives in many ways. And that transcends kind of many of the ideological divisions on this. It's a schizophrenic time when it comes to the view of government. According to a recent Pew poll, just about 22% of Americans trust government all or most of the time, the lowest level in 50 years. And at the same time, I think in the last 15 or 20 years, our government has had some considerable successes, reducing violent crime, welfare reform, issues like AIDS and malaria, where the United States has really taken a global lead. I would argue even in military strategy, in the coin strategy in Iraq and now in Afghanistan, an education movement that's making a big difference in places like DC and New York. And so in America, we have a government that's been successful in a number of ways, and yet most Americans would find the statement I just made laughable. And so, it's just some of what we want to do today and ask our panelists is to explain why. Congresswoman, let me start with a more on the negative side here, and hopefully we'll get to the positive as we move along. Just a year and a half ago, Washington was supposed to have a new beginning. And now that is hard even to remember, living in the DC community. Who's to blame?
Isn't that always the question that's asked? Who's bad? Well, let me start this way. First of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. Coming from you, I value it very much. And as I just said, if all of you heard me, I don't hear this at home. As a bipartisan Democrat, I am target practice from both sides. I want you to all feel sorry for me. Being in the center is quite lonely these days, and there is almost no political value attached to bipartisanship. Having said all this, I took a long run this morning because then I thought I'd be more positive, except it didn't work. It's not. I thought, and I think much of the country thought, that the election of Barack Obama would change the climate in Washington. That was one of his campaign pledges. I know he was genuine in making the pledge, and lots of voters, including me, were genuine in hoping it would be a reality, but hey, it isn't. There was a brief flurry of activity. I know he went to the Republican caucuses on the Hill. I think there was about a 5-minute honeymoon. But the guy inherited the worst set of problems in history. And I'm not blaming all of them on George Bush. I am not doing that. But the list of 2 wars, a terrible economy, and a variety of other things is enough of the stuff of nightmares. So that's clear. But I think that this promise of changing the climate in Washington has, at least yet, not been kept. And I constantly refer to Congress as a toxic pit. It's not a lot of fun to work in a toxic pit. I think it's not a lot of fun for people in both parties. Yes, I'm in the majority party, but it is hard, no one is missing this, to get a majority of votes for almost anything. And many Democrats don't support the Democratic leadership agenda. A few Republicans do support it, but most of them don't support it. And eking out victories on a variety of topics involves a huge number of compromises and a lot of angry noise, not just inside of Congress, but obviously outside. Let me just make a few points about Congress, since I'm so negative, things that are truly broken. And I have to say that even if, and I do not think this will happen, even if we change the majority in November in one house, I think we won't in either house, although I think the majority will be slimmer in both houses. I don't think it's going to change. So here's my list of awful things about Congress. The perpetual campaign. A 2-year cycle means you are always campaigning. I don't know if it was like this in 1790, but it is surely like this now. Even Sidney Harman wasn't alive in 1790. So he doesn't. The endless amount of money sloshing around, which some would argue and some might not argue, was further increased by a recent Supreme Court decision, and our failure to try to pass something that will require more disclosure. It has passed the House, but it hasn't passed the Senate. The effectiveness of negative ads, which are used by both parties all the time, and the who's to blame point is the right point, because negative ads always blame the other guy. And they work, and most politicians use them. And to think about making government work when what you're trying to do is blame the other guy is pretty hopeless. And finally, well, 2 more. One, the leadership in Congress in both parties comes from safe districts. Safe districts are districts where there is less bipartisanship. I'm not casting aspersions on any of the leaders, but if the leadership is safe, that encourages them to move further from the center, both sides, which encourages the endless warfare that we are seeing play out. And then finally, the jurisdiction in Congress is broken. As someone who focuses on security issues, and most recently Homeland Security, we have not reorganized Congress in light of the really thoughtful recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. Everything else sort of kind of has been improved, but there really are 88 committees and subcommittees that have something to do with Homeland Security in the Congress, and that makes it almost impossible to get anything done. So other than that, I'm very positive.
Well, when we talked before this session, and I asked who was to blame, you said I was to blame. So that I'm glad you didn't make that point.
I thought better of that, Matt, after my run.
But Henrietta, one of the areas where the reputation of government has traditionally been lowest is foreign assistance. You know, I'm familiar, I've done some work with the Gates Foundation. Their polling shows a lot of Americans think this is money thrown down a rat hole. And I'm curious, given the kind of results we've seen over the last decade, how do you explain that gap? What elements of that criticism are correct and which ones are false?
Sounds like we're encouraging the optimism.
Right. Right.
Well, foreign assistance and foreign aid around the world is something that Americans really care about. And as a result, there are many, many actors. It's a very complex and interwoven activity. So it could be your local church or your local school that's involved. It could be a local nonprofit organization or a business or a foundation or your local university or college or high school. And so there are lots and lots of actors and players. And with that comes a lot of expectations and hopes and enormously good intentions. And what happens when you are in this field is that you see thousands of extraordinary projects where people have lifted lives and they've lifted communities, and you're so proud of them. And then you see some that just break your heart. They're a waste of money, they're a waste of time. They've raised people's hopes and then we've let them down, either as the United States or as a smaller entity as Americans. And some of that disconnect comes because you don't get it right all the time. You're going to have some failures. And some of it comes because people don't write enough about the lessons learned and the best practices, and we don't share it. We've talked about having a global commons, a place where you can go if you're an individual who wants to help an orphanage in the Philippines or a company who wants to do education projects in Rwanda, but a place where you can connect with others who are doing the same work in a country. We still don't have that. And so as a result, it's a very disconnected community. And I think that leads to some of that gap that you're talking about. As you know, in the Bush administration, we tried to put foreign assistance into baskets. And so we had a basket that was security and peace. So this basket looks after the training of police. Another one is good governance and governing justly and democratically. And so this is judicial systems and ways to encourage political parties and ways to run governments and parliaments well. And another one is for human development. So health and education, very important in any civil society. And then the next one is economic growth. And for this one, it's the encouragement of businesses and entrepreneurs and ways that we can help on food and energy. And then the last one's humanitarian assistance. And as we looked at all of those, the keys were to try to integrate. And when you come to Congress and our oversight committees, just similar to what Jane was saying about Homeland Security, in every one of these baskets, we have multiple oversight committees. And we have 28 agencies who do foreign assistance overseas. And then we have thousands of partners in all these sectors, which is a good thing, but it leads to dispersion. And as a result, it's very difficult to get critical mass and to scale up the finest projects. So I think that's part of the disconnect that you're talking about.
It makes a lot of sense. Paul, public servants, or bureaucrats, depending on your perspective, get some of the worst press when it comes to the role of government. And I'm curious what your experience, whether you view that as being fair or unfair, what some of the trends are in that area, but how the respect is being restored on the administrative side of government.
Sure. Well, the agency that I run, I'm from government, I'm here to help you. And the agency that I run, and resetting, actually, I should tell you a few things about it. And this is an agency devoted to good government. The slide you see is really my point. I hope, and many of you probably know this slide. You've seen if you've been to Siena, you know that this is the famous Lorenzetti fresco in the Piazza Pubblico in Siena, and everyone goes to see it during Palio. So, which we did once, my wife and I, and I've decided to make a copy of this and put it in my office, in my new agency, which I'm setting up. Now, this is good government. As you see, everything works. And by the way, there's a woman running this government, as you know. This is the 14th century. Then there's bad government. I'm not going to show you bad government because you've already heard about it and you probably know too much about it. So I'm going to keep this up while I'm talking. Now, the agency is called the Administrative Conference of the United States. It's a little agency, but it was zeroed out. It was started by President Johnson in the 60s, actually through executive order by President Kennedy. And I've had involvement with it as a legal scholar over the years. And it's an agency designed to improve the performance of government, to make it more efficient and fair. And my motto is going to be that government innovation is not an oxymoron. It is set up, the council is about to be announced tomorrow. 10-member council that runs it. I'm the chair of the council. I'm the only full-time employee. The council is 5 public and 5 private, or we call public members, but 5 government and 5 public members, politically balanced, which is very important, because the idea of this agency is that it will be balanced in its thinking, and something that Jane mentioned is very important. Bipartisanship is going to be built into this agency. And then it has a membership of 90 members who vote in plenary session on projects that are teed up by the consultants and the scholars that work on it. That membership is half government agency representatives, general counsels, others, and key figures, chairs sometime of agencies, and half public members, again, divided among, politically divided, and also in terms of professionally from economists and lawyers and others in the world of both of practice and of scholarship. So that's how we set up, that's how we're structured. Now we have to come up with good ideas. My thinking is very much, first of all, to support something that may not be as familiar to you, and that's not only government innovation, but government transparency, government openness, to buy into the new media, the new world we're living in. Because government is very slow. The prior program was talking about a reset in the economy. Richard Florida's work, very interesting. We need a reset in government. We need to restructure how we make decisions. We need to get closer to where the change is really taking place, and we need to absorb it. That's very hard for government to do. Structurally, it's hard. And so I've got to help work on that. And I do believe we can make progress. This is still an undercurrent. I know Vivek Kundra is here from the Obama administration, but one of the things you talked about, and probably it's not yet visible in the public, is that the administration is opening things up in dramatic ways. There's now a website called data.gov. If you go on it, it's got, all agencies are required to post information. This is a transformative move. You know, here in the past, agencies would hold information, and you'd have to get a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request, to get the information, and there would be objections. Now the government is told by the White House, post everything you can. You know, privacy, obviously you've got to be concerned about privacy issues and things like that, but post it all. On data.gov, if you look on that website, the public is now using this data and turning it into things and creating things with it. They even rate them. They've got 5 stars, you know. It's like a restaurant review. Someone has gone before you, rates the quality of the information. It's all in XML format, so it can be manipulated, used, and trained, and created, so that you can have partners in the private sector working with government to make things better. And that's what I see. One of our jobs is to spread that word, build it out, you know, make sure we are doing the right things, and we're transforming things. Now, fairness and efficiency are 2 different measures, right? Fairness is a legal measure, efficiency is an economic measure. I've got to merge those 2. I'll give you one. We haven't done any reports yet because obviously the council hasn't been appointed and I can't get too far out ahead of my bosses, but take immigration, the process of immigration. And I try and separate the politics of immigration right? About which there's all kinds of difficult things, which means you can't get an immigration bill from the process. Now, people are subject to a system, many of whom, these are asylum cases, which are the dominant number of cases, hundreds of thousands of cases, people sitting in private prisons waiting 3 years to have a case heard. Now, that shouldn't be. We have the same problem with Social Security disability, where people wait for years to get a hearing or get through the hearing process. That shouldn't be. We should look to ways to make it more efficient. We should, the difference is, in disability, if you ultimately prevail, you get a back award from which you can pay your attorney's fees. In the immigration field, if your 3 years in prison is never compensated for, and you don't have money to pay an attorney. Those are real social problems in government. Those are maybe more micro problems. I mean, than innovation as a general proposition, but those are the heart of the kinds of things we should be looking at as an agency designed to make government better. Not to politicize it, to try and depoliticize it. At the same time, I think we can share a value that efficient government and fair government is a matter of high order.
David, from a slightly different perspective, I know you're a student of the presidency. It strikes me that a lot of the public discourse about the president, ever since the time of Bill Clinton, has gone from disagreement to contempt. Questions about legitimacy that you see for the last 3 presidents of the United States fairly broadly held. And I'm wondering how that affects the possibility of government doing its job, particularly when it comes to leadership of the executive branch. And just to get your feel.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mike. And it's a very, very important question. I do think that we have had a shift, and it's partly generational, if I may say so. I think that the World War II generation, which essentially governed the country from the early 1960s until 1992, and these were people who basically came of age during the World War II years. We had 7 presidents from John Kennedy through George Bush Sr. who were considered our World War II presidents. Now, what was remarkable about that group was that all 7 of those presidents served in a military uniform, 6 of them in the war itself. And because they had that sense of service to the country when they were young, I think there was more of a sense of common bonding, a sense of common sacrifice, and a willingness to serve a higher good when they came back and were in our political system. And with the disappearance of that generation from the stage, I think we've entered a new generation, the generation that was born basically in the 1940s. I'm part of this generation. And we did not come of age at a time of common sacrifice. We came of age in the 60s and 70s. You know, and the Vietnam War split our generation right down the middle. And there was a lot of progress that came out of the 60s. Very important movement started in the 60s for social justice. But our generation became very split about values. You know, if you went to school in Iowa or Oklahoma, you had very different values than if you were at Berkeley or Ann Arbor. And we have never really healed as a generation. What I think is encouraging is that there is now generations coming along behind us who are much more united, much more idealistic, and one of the things we've been celebrating at Aspen this week is the emergence of these new generations that I think hold out so much hope for the country. So it's partly generational, Mike, but I also think we need to distinguish between our political system and government. Our political system is, I think, to go back to Jane Harman's point, very largely broken. Our political system responds well to crises still, and we've always done that, going back to the Pearl Harbor and going all the way through 9/11. And I believe the government, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, deserve more credit than they get from stopping us from going over a cliff economically. You know, we were a couple of times within hours of a financial collapse, and I think Hank Paulson and George Bush, as well as the new team of Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and Barack Obama and others, deserve a lot more credit than they get for preventing crises. In our political system, we are not very good at responding to chronic problems that build up. As an economist at Brookings said some years ago, America is terrific when there's a wolf at the door. We're just not very good when there are termites in the basement. And I think our political system is increasingly having trouble with chronic problems. We can come back to that. When it comes to government, the actual running of government. I think that's a more mixed bag. I have some years ago, the Ford Foundation started a program called Innovations in American Government. And I've been on the selection committee for, I guess, 20 years now, and I've been chairman of the selection committee for 10 years or so. We see a lot of applications coming in from not only national, but state and local government. And there's some remarkable success stories out around the country in local and state government that we should not forget. Mm-hmm. My increasing impression is government itself can work well if we're modest about what we ask of it. We sometimes ask way too much, and we ask it to do things it cannot do well. But if we're modest about our expectations and our demands on government, if it is well led, which is very important, the leadership question to me is extremely important, and if it's adaptive. Take the U.S. Army, which was almost broken after the Vietnam War. Jane knows this so well. And a lot of us were despairing about where that army was going. But there was enormous leadership from within to transform the U.S. military. And today, if you look at most units of government, and I think most of us would say you look at General Petraeus, he is a model leader for many of us today, and someone that we would entrust a lot to, but if we don't ask him to do the impossible. But he leads well and he's very adaptive. On the other end, look at what Bill Bratton did in New York. Mm-hmm. And when people thought crime was hopeless.
And Los Angeles.
And Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And he's just retired from the two of them. But he was an extraordinary leader. He remains, I think, one of the best public servants we've had. But he also was very adaptive. And he brought CompStat to New York, which was bringing the modern computer system into fighting crime. He brought it into Los Angeles. And you saw terrific results. But we were asking him to do something that was fundamental. We weren't asking him to do way too much. He was very well led. And he was an extraordinarily adaptive leader. So to me, one has to sort of be a little bit, I think we can rail on about our politics, but I think we have to be somewhat respectful and understand that in some cases government works, and in the oil spill, I don't think it's working. And I don't think it's working in part because perhaps we're asking too much of the federal government, but I don't think this is being well led. I don't think there's a command and control structure in terms of dealing with this that is clear-cut, that you have somebody on the top with a real team who can go in and fight this oil spill and protect the coast in a way we should. I think it's really damaged public faith in government. And, my view from the beginning has been, if we had fought the Second World War the way we're fighting the oil spill, most of us would probably be speaking German now. So there are instances where I don't think we do well, and there are other instances in which we have a Bill Bratton or a David Petraeus, and there are many women who have done this extraordinarily well as well, in which I think we have had some real successes.
David, that's a very interesting distinction between politics and government. And let me kind of deal with both of those issues because we have them both represented to some extent on the panel. Let's start with politics. My concern is we're going to very soon face the biggest test of whether government works as it relates to debt, deficits, and spending. Okay. That is a circumstance where that's been the termite in the basement for a long time, but now the termites have grown to 20 feet tall. Okay, where it may threaten actually, many people coming to the realization that America may not be too big to fail. Okay. And I'm curious, we have a dysfunctional political system that you described facing a long-term problem that's becoming an acute problem, even an existential problem. And I'm wondering what the prospects are in that, as we move forward, because it seems just as important as some of the governing aspects that you talk about.
Anyone who heard Neil Ferguson and Mort Zuckerman in one of the opening sessions, remembers just how dire the warnings were about the financial collapses lead to physical crises, and physical crises can often bring great nations down quickly. That was their major argument. So I do think this is a critical test of our will and of our political capacity and of our self-governance capacity. Are we still a self-governing people? I am not sure. I defer to Jane Harman on what the prospects are. I have views. And by the way, I'm encouraged, Mike, from the Deficit Commission. I'm hearing interesting reports about Erskine Bowles as one of the co-chairs, beginning to develop or build a coalition within the commission that might be very, very constructive. We'll have to see where it goes, but I'm just hearing from the outside. But I'd really defer to Jane.
Yeah, no, I'm interested. I mean, this is an area where if government succeeds, it will do a very important job. Yeah. If it fails, it's going to be dramatic failure of government. And I'm just...
Well, let me say how surprised I am, and probably we all are, by this new government in Britain. I mean, who would have thought 6 months ago that there would be this hybrid government that was proposing massive changes both to the political system of Britain and to its ability to manage its debt. And I would never have predicted that that could happen. So one thing that occurs to me, and I've been thinking about this for the last few days at this conference, is that we may be let out of this. Imagine this by old Europe. They may have better ideas than we do. They may have started in a worse place. Talk about termites in the basement. They have termites in the attic. It's gone all through the house. And we may be let out of this because we will see them adapting and changing in ways we couldn't imagine. And that might inspire the political class to be a little more gutsy. Having said that, I don't think you can separate politics from governance. I mean, you can do it in an intellectual way. But I think the way Washington works now, they mesh. You know, maybe, Paul, you can lead us out of this with your bipartisan administrative conference. But everywhere you turn, there is politics on top of governance, I think. And that's part of the problem. This minerals mining service, or I've got its name wrong, at the Interior Department was a totally corrupted organization. Right. That didn't start with the Obama administration, but notwithstanding Ken Salazar's pledge to fix it, it wasn't fixed in time to prevent, or at least to mitigate, this horrific oil spill. So this has been happening for years. We overlay political appointees on top of organizations, some of which are very capable and some of which aren't. But nonetheless, we've meshed these things in a way that drags down the whole enterprise. I am a Blue Dog Democrat. That's true. The Blue Dogs are a group of Democrats. It's a long story. It's about yellow dog Democrats, but if you strangle them, they turn blue. Go figure. Mostly a sort of southern organization. However, they even have female grandmothers from Los Angeles as part of this group, and the brand is Fiscal Responsibility. And it was a very potent organization in the 90s. When, with enormous difficulty, starting with, in my view, the potentially career-ending vote which I made for the Clinton '93 budget, which passed by one vote. I was representing a lean Republican district, and this was my first term in Congress. And I almost lost in '94. Many people lost. That was when Newt came to power. Many Democrats lost. But I hung on by 800 votes. Sidney Harman claims he cast them all. I don't believe it. I don't even know if he voted for me. He likes more liberal Democrats. But anyway, put that aside. So the Blue Dogs were very effective in the 90s. We got to budget balance, to remind us all. That was a bipartisan vote in 1997. And then we had a surplus. And when President Bush was elected, we were all talking about, should we use some of the surplus to pay down the debt? Does anybody remember this conversation? Okay, so segue to now. The Blue Dogs, which I still belong to, go through these hand-wringing sessions. I think they would agree. These are the people, most of them, in the most marginal seats in Congress, which means they could be either Democratic or Republican seats. And everybody's focused on, oh my God, if I vote here, then do I, it's my personal re-election story. And so the group has not been as courageous. The group doesn't have its own budget anymore, which was one of the hallmarks. Okay, so take that and then go to the Deficit Commission, which is a good thing. It has most commissions, to remind you, David, not that you didn't know, have no real power. This one doesn't. But it is going to report after the election. It has very capable leadership and a good membership. Only the 9/11 Commission really got traction, I think, in our recent history. But if they come up with a good set of recommendations, will Congress do it? So, based on any recent information, I would say no. If the Republicans take over Congress, will the Republican Party do it? I mean, these are going to be hard. This is going to be entitlement reform, tax reform, raising taxes will have to be on the table, et cetera.
David, just briefly.
Does it become easier to deal with the deficit if it's more bipartisan, if the Republicans pick up enough seats to have a very slim, the Democrats maintain a slim majority? Is it easier to govern in a bipartisan way?
Well, I think it's always easier to govern from the center with bipartisan support. I think better policy is made. But if control shifts or if the Democratic majority is narrow, I just said, I don't think that's going to improve not on anything I can see. I think, frankly, if things get horrific and our bond ratings go in the toilet and the rest of the world moves on without us, I mean, that is imaginable. It's not likely, but it's imaginable. Yeah, maybe everyone will wake up and say, oh my God, we are in a crisis here and we have to pull together. We did pull together for a while after 9/11 to remind everybody. So it is not impossible. I'm just saying, based on the recent politics that I observe up close and personal, which are not a lot of fun, I don't think, for anybody in them, in either side, I think it's very challenging. So,
Henrietta, let me raise another existential issue that sometimes which people don't confront adequately. But we found in a variety of global settings that when you have disorder, poverty, famine, that you have the emergence of global problems that affect the United States very, very directly. Okay? And both this administration and the previous administration have really placed development at the center of the American foreign policy agenda as a matter of national security, part of the 3 Ds as they approach this. But the rhetoric is very different from the way we implement these programs. They're not centrally directed, they're not outcome-oriented. I remember at the White House, we attempted to get just a list of all of our democracy promotion programs. It took over a year. They were in dozens of agencies, and a significant portion of that list had nothing to do with democracy promotion. Okay? It was just put in there for budget reasons. I'm just curious about how you overcome this gap between the rhetorical emphasis and need we have for effective development policy and the practice, the governing practice of this. What are the practical ways that you overcome that gap?
Well, Michael, you're absolutely right that this is one of the big challenges in government. And it's not just in development, but in development you see it because development, diplomacy, and defense should all be together in our national interest, moving together. And often around the world we are seen as leading with our military rather than leading in development or leading in diplomacy. And you want to switch that around, which means you need to rebalance some of your resources. But it is very, very difficult. And your comment about democracy goes back to David's comment about who's in charge. We don't put one person, one agency in charge. And as a result, you're asked to collaborate with everyone. And you collaborate with your first 10 people, and you collaborate with your next 50 people, and then now you're into about 150, because there are 70 independent agencies, and there are a lot of departments, and a lot of parts of departments, and not everyone has the same information, and most of our information systems do not talk to each other, so you can't share information online yet, but hopefully this will come about. And so as a result, people are not well informed. They're not able to give enough information to the public or to Congress or to each other, and so collaboration is just, it's really tough. You wouldn't run a business like this. And so why do we do it with our own government? I mean, to me, it is just time to really get serious about cutting some of our paperwork, and it would save money if we can streamline this, and this is the time to do it. Jane's good comments about look at what's happening in Britain is what we see in the development world about how we would talk to a country like the United States about their fiscal imbalances. And we would say, cut your costs. We would say, become bipartisan. We would say, focus on growth and entrepreneurship and innovation. We would say all of those things. So now it's time for America to do it ourselves here.
Yeah, it's interesting from the White House perspective. We ended up having almost 24 presidential initiatives because of how inertial the system itself was, okay? So you could take an issue like AIDS, put Randy Tobias in charge, make him accountable to put, 2 million people on treatment, hold the institutions of government accountable for outcomes. But it was so much harder to reform the broader system, which is what should happen. Every country should have outcomes with our aid and other things. But it's an interesting challenge. So that, executives are often then, they've become focused on one issue, which can become a problem itself because you're dividing things even further.
And Michael, if I could just add in one
sure.
thing on that. In that case, presidential initiatives focus people and resources, and that's very helpful. And the benefits that have come back to us as the United States from the whole HIV/AIDS and health programs that are moving are enormous, and education programs and others. So that one should think about it as an investment. And where do we want to invest our money as a nation?
Right. Paul, I know you want to react to several of these things, but I'm interested in how you then overcome some of the inertia in systems, okay, that I see. First of all, traditional institutions protect themselves, okay, if you're talking about education reform and other things. Second, people that take risks when they do social innovation are sometimes punished. It's not normally the way that government officials work. It's easier to lay low in a certain way rather than make mistakes, and as we were talking earlier. But I'm curious how then you begin to change not just practices but the culture of these institutions.
Right. No, that's a very big issue, and I think it goes back to what David was saying too about how much can government do. Leadership is obviously, everyone says, and it's true, that's the crucial factor. We also have to realize that structurally, we are a very complicated government, more complicated than England. We have something called separation of powers. It doesn't really exist in England. We have something called the federal system, which is an aspect of separation of powers, which is why, by the way, it's hard to take over the Gulf oil, the oil problem on the Gulf. I was a volunteer lawyer for the governor of Louisiana during the Katrina crises, and I can tell you the clashes between jurisdictions is part of the problem. And it's true, people in government or bureaucrats are risk averse. They know they'll get paid if they don't step out too far because they've seen examples of what people do and they get punished. And so we do have to worry about that, but we also have to worry about the structure. Just today in the Times it said that the state and BP want to build a wall across to save underwater to save the marshes in Louisiana. And in comes the Corps of Engineers and it says, no, you can't do that. That's environmental controls. You'll destroy it, right? So that's a clash of jurisdictions. There's no one capable. There's no, the ultimate czar here. We have the same thing. We're going to be big government, by the way. The health care bill has 55 new boards and commissions involved in those 2,000 pages. One of the things I hope we'll be able to help with is trying to help set these things up. But I'm talking about complicated decisions. The financial legislation will have equal number of complicated new regulatory structures. So we are actually in an era of big government. It may not be the New Deal, and certainly, the Reagan period, getting rid of a lot of regulations, the deregulation movement is still a very important dimension. But we have to also worry about structure. I see Justice O'Connor here, and the Supreme Court has a role. There was just a case decided, Freedom Fund versus SEC, saying that the accounting board can't be independent. Well, that was thought to be independent because that would make the public have more trust in it. But it's under separation of powers theory, it can't be independent. A 5-4 case. Justice Breyer's dissent lists 150 agencies that have similar kinds of problems. So this is a structural issue that has deep constitutional roots. And finally, let me just say this: the issue about who's running government, should it be the political appointees, of which there aren't that many, 3,000 or 4,000? Should it be the civil service, including the senior executive service, who are very competent people? Or should it be the contractors, the third source of government employment? And let me say, contractors is a sort of below-the-radar issue that's very important. No one knows how many contractors there are in government. No one knows the number. Paul Light, who's a scholar at NYU, he says, well, there's 6 contractors for every government employee, and there are 2 million government employees in the civil sector. So if that's true, that's an enormous number of contractors out there. But these contractors work, they work for agencies, but in some, like USAID, they replace the agency in many respects. These are DOE, Department of Energy. These are agencies that are hollowed out and run by contractors. Contractors don't have to, can get paid more. They don't have the same ethics rules as federal employees, and it's complicated. So it's very hard to get yourself around who is actually running the government. The political side, the president, I think, in this area is trying very hard to be transformative, and he knows that he's got more duties coming and he's got to get good people, but working the system, both federal and state, is really part of the complication.
David?
I don't know about you. I have this, because I'm like Jane, I come from more of the sort of the raging middle. And I find that when we have a conservative government in the White House, it tends to bring out my more liberal instincts. And when we have a liberal government in the White House, it tends to bring out my more conservative instincts. And it's sort of an odd thing, but I do share this concern now that we are moving toward a bigger government than we can handle, that is healthy for the country. On the regulatory side, we have 250,000 people in this country who are now employed by government to either write or enforce regulations. And that number is going to go steadily up. And I think the healthcare field is one in which I have very grave concerns of whether we're asking government to do more than it can appropriately do. With 55 new boards and commissions, this is going to get more complicated and less accountable than when we try to keep things a little simple and keep as much power down in the system to empower people at the lower levels to make decisions, rather than trying to bring these into a Washington type of structure. I worry that we're moving toward a country that is increasingly going to be divided by those who pay for government and those who don't have much of the burden. We're at a point now where 47% of all households in this country do not pay any federal income taxes. 47% of the households, they pay payroll taxes, but they don't pay income taxes. Now what that means is, if the question arises, would you rather raise taxes or cut services, guess which way they're going to come out? That's a no-brainer. We're also moving to the point, there's another study out, that 60% of the people in this country now receive more in benefits from government than they pay into government. 60% receive more back from government than they pay in. And on the course we're now on, that number is going to get closer to 70%. That, to me, is moving away from the kind of innovation, self-reliance, kind of entrepreneurship that many of us believe is going to be the answer to working our way out of some of these crises. So I think that we're not going to spend our way out of this crisis. We're not going to borrow our way out of this crisis. We're going to have to innovate our way out. And that's going to require a spirit and a recognition that the private sector, yes, it needs to be regulated, but also needs to be vital. And it needs to have a sort of an inner drive and motivation to build and create jobs. And I do worry right now that we're increasingly asking more and more of government, and that's going to be at the expense of the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit.
Congresswoman, I'm interested in your reaction. I'm interested in you. You were a strong supporter of the health care bill. One of the things that concerned me about the bill was that one of the main public reasons to pass it was cost control. Okay. Right. And those were the parts, as you got closer and closer to passage, that got weaker and weaker in the bill. Okay. And that doesn't bode well for other entitlement reforms and other things. People like the benefits, and they may have been justified, the benefits from health care. But the disciplined aspect of government running itself well and limiting other costs seem to get weaker over time.
Well, that is true. I am a strong supporter of health care reform. Did I love this bill? No. I don't know anyone who loved this bill. This bill was what Congress could pass. And for all of you gasping out there, well, gee, was that enough? Why would someone like me vote for that? I made a decision that there was enough good in it to merit moving forward, because the alternative was not moving. And sadly, a lot of the votes come down to that. And I don't think that's swell. I don't at all. But what happened was some better ideas, including robust competition among private insurance plans, which I am for, which would have lowered costs, got watered down. Interest groups of various kinds, they shall all be nameless. We all, it's a democracy, went to work on this. And the White House cut deals with a few interest groups. No one missed this, like the drug industry, which meant that the cost to the drug industry would not exceed, I think it was $80 billion, which meant that we couldn't do some things that I wanted to do, like permit the government under Medicare to bargain for lower drug prices. To remind you all, there was an all-night vote during the Bush administration.
I remember that, yeah.
That resulted in passing Medicare Part D, which for oldies like me, you understand is the drug benefit piece of Medicare. But in the Medicare Part D, there is a provision that the government cannot bargain for lower drug prices. The VA can bargain for lower drug prices, your insurance company can bargain, but the government can't. And I thought, hey, repealing that would be a good way, talk about controlling costs. Drug costs are the highest rising part of health costs. We ought to repeal that. We ought to do a variety of other things to promote competition. This is something I think we're all for, which would lower prices, and we didn't get that. So I'm not shilling for this health care bill except to say it was much better than to me, the alternative. And I do cringe to hear there were 55 more commissions and so forth. Similarly, energy. The House passed a version of cap and trade, but to get that through the House, a whole bunch of industries had to be helped along, or we wouldn't have had the votes. The energy fight is regional. It's more regional than partisan. And if you're from the oil patch, you don't want oil companies hurt, and if you're from the coal patch, et cetera, and if you're from California, you don't care about any of them and you want clean energy. But the point is, and that has a cost too. So everybody it was a big fight. So I don't think our cap and trade bill was heroic, and it's not going anywhere in the Senate. So we're not getting a lot of this stuff done. And it's a fair question to ask whether it's worth it. My answer is that everyone here has some terrific insights. And I do think we ought to be less, we ought to expect somewhat less of government. But let's remember this. The financial crisis that we are now in was caused by, I would say, unregulated, irresponsible actions of some of our financial institutions. And that sank the economies of the world. So our response, maybe not so perfect. Again, our financial reform bill that the House and Senate are passing took a lot of good things out in order to pass it. Our response has been, that's not okay. That hurt a lot of innocent people. We need a different, better regulatory system that includes some of the kind of speculative products that we saw developed in the free marketplace. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a perfect answer here, but I think I'm going to take another long run so my outlook improves. But I think we got to bet on good government at every level.
That's why I put up the Lorenzetti fresco. By the way, They want us to go to questions and answers.
I saw that.
You saw that.
So now I think we'll join. We've got plenty to provoke discussion here. So I'd love to, if people have questions, I think they're bringing around microphones. So
I'm going to go for my plane.
okay, you're not leaving in protest. You're heading to a plane.
I was going to go out for a long run, actually.
Great.
I have a question. I have a question. My name's Ann Tate. And it seems in this discussion that there is a premise that we could do better if we governed a little more from the center. But when Jane Harman is talking about the compromises that have been made on these bills, they don't seem to me to be defining a center. They seem to be responses to corporate pressure. Could you address the distinction between accommodating lobbyists and governing from the center?
Yikes. Very good. That was a good question. That is a good question. And I don't turn blue, even blue dog, when I think of lobbyists. I think sometimes it's important to get specialized information from people outside. Members of Congress, I think every one of us doesn't come to the job knowing enough to make the best decisions. And there are lobbyists for environmental causes, and there are lobbyists for all kinds of things. So I guess I see the lobbying that changes bills not in the center. I see it further out. I actually think if members of Congress, many of whom, most of whom, are intelligent and public-spirited and came to Congress to add some value, I see us as capable of making better decisions if we work together. That's what my point is. And I think that some of the deals made with lobbyists, which then bring some members into the group that will vote for a bill, are really not in the center. But it's a good question, and I'm not absolutely sure that I'm answering it well enough.
Please, who's next? Should we go back here?
Okay. Craig, in customer service, an observation followed by a request. You already have a lot of people in the federal grassroots who aren't waiting and who are fixing the government from within without, sometimes without full authorization. I'd like you guys to give more of a shout out for them. You got people in Veterans Affairs with the Innovation Initiative. HHS just launched their Innovation Initiative. There's the open government people in OSTP, and also you got the modernizing government people with a great focus on customer service. Did I mention customer service? And a lot of good people doing that kind of stuff. What they seem to need is simply a lot more attention and praise lavished on them. Include the Federal Web Managers Council, and again, focus on customer service. And I think that would actually move things ahead in a really big way. And let's start doing a lot more press on that, if you can do that. I'd appreciate it.
Interested in you, Paul?
Well, I very much appreciate that. Customer service is what it's about, and I do think government is doing some very important things, and that's one of the points of our agency is to highlight those things and to expand on them and then use best practices, to establish best practices in agencies and transform them, expand them throughout government. Let me just make a point on this. We need good talent in government. It's not easy always to get good talent in government. One of the problems is that this difference between contractors and civil servants. If we say, and the White House is worrying about this, if the White House said it wanted to expand the size of government by 10%, 200,000 people, let's say, in the civil side, there'd be a hue and cry, oh, government is expanding. But if we took those out of the contractor side, where we're paying for them already at much higher cost in many cases, you wouldn't notice it on the budget. And I do think you have to think about how we can get good people in government, the kind of talented people that want to serve, often young people, often people who don't have a history of service, and we need to install those into government. And use then highlighting these good practices. The race to the top is another example in the education field.
Henrietta, that's a huge problem at USAID, kind of expertise and internal competence and other things. That was a consistent complaint when I was in government.
Yes, absolutely. The people in government are your greatest asset. It's their knowledge, it's their ability, their innovations. They are your strongest positive influence. And so you really have to think about how to train, how to hire, how to encourage them a great deal. But could I just add in something that we did at the U.S. Mint that was very helpful? We measured our customer service. So we measured how long it took to answer the phone. And when we first started, you'd see 3 minutes, 9 minutes. That's not good enough. Phones have to be answered by the third ring, period. And we got there quickly once we began measuring it. And I think sometimes we don't measure them, and then we don't give acclaim to the groups that are doing great jobs, because then they've done something, it becomes a best practice, and people then all move to it in an agency. And agencies will respond to it, and offices will respond to it. So measurements, setting good measurements, and then giving awards really helps.
Metrics. Maybe in the back there?
Hi, my name's Judy Steinberg. Somebody was making a distinction earlier about the difference between government and business. Government is a business, and businesses all go through cycles, and they go through downsizings. They go through businesses go through creative destruction. Product lines go away, individual products go away. If there are 55 new agencies or subcommittees or commissions or whatever coming out of both the healthcare bill and the financial regulation bill, why aren't there 55 subcommittees, commissions, and whatever else going away? Why is it that government, everybody's talking around the issue of downsizing government, but I think that also needs to be addressed.
Government tends to be additive, so there's always a new layer.
Well, Congress sets a very bad example. I think you heard me at the front part. Nobody gives up any jurisdiction. And so if we're going to add another committee, like the Homeland Security Committee, we add it. But it doesn't have much jurisdiction because no one will give it up. And so when we legislate, following the congressional model, that's not very good. You raise a good point. I don't know that it's linear, that if you add A, you should take away B, although we now have passed a law called PAYGO, which means that if you add a program, you have to pay for it out of existing budget. And if we could actually do that, of course we just passed a supplemental that's outside of the budget, but if we could actually do that, it is the principle you're talking about, and it is right to demand that programs that are set up operate in an efficient and fair way. And I have nominated Paul Verkyle to change everything and make it work like that.
All right, we need more of that. You want to go here?
Did you vote for her?
First, I am Sidney Harman. I'm widely known as Jane Harman's trophy husband. I woke this morning in very, very good spirit, was uncertain whether I should come to this gathering. I think I should have stayed in bed. There is a level of pessimism here that I don't quite share. This nation gets the government, it has often been said, that it deserves. And there was offered by David Gergen a taxonomy of the generations through which he has lived. I begin with Appomattox. And as I move through those generations, I recognize that we are departing one where the overwhelming focus was to get out of school and join the gaming crowd, to get into that financial world and get mine. That really is changing very, very dramatically today, and overwhelmingly. students are looking to the sciences and the social sciences, increasingly to philosophy and to poetry and the stuff that makes for enlarging societies and better governments. And so before I took quick leave of this time and this government, I would pay a nod to this new arriving generation. Henrietta said at a moment of despair, businesses would never run that way. Oh, Henrietta, they do.
Can I add one point here, just on an upbeat note? I recently went to an inner city school in Washington, D.C., in one of the worst areas of the city. And there are Teach for America kids there that, they're supposed to spend 1 year. I talked to one woman who was staying at least 3 years because she had to finish what she started. And the interesting thing for me, Paul, was that the local leadership of that school was trying to leverage community resources, go outside traditional systems, be outcome-oriented in what they're doing under the leadership of Michelle Reed, and change a culture, change an entire culture. And all elements seem to make a difference: leadership level, structures, and then market in a certain way, making things more responsive to what people need. But I agree with the comment. I mean, I saw some just exceptional young people that are creating this extraordinary transfer of social capital from elite education institutions into the worst schools in America, in a movement that you would not have expected. And that there are some governments, local governments, that are smart enough to recognize that something big is going on when it comes to social innovation within government. So that was encouraging to me. But, so, yeah, please.
Can I just build on that? And Sydney's, public-private partnerships have really been a very interesting model that I think have enormous sway for future decades. And they're similar to what you're just talking about, the excitement and vibrancy, but we have something to learn from each other. So it's really important to reach out and to leverage each other in other sectors so that a nonprofit and a foundation and the government and a business can be in these public-private partnerships, whether you're addressing health or education or other activities. They're very powerful gatherings.
Well, I want to thank the panelists for being here today, and for David as well. So.